Welcome to this webinar on international trade and health, hosted by the Center for Trade and Economic Integration. I'd like to welcome and thank the panelists for participating and welcome the participants who are all online. My name is Richard Baldwin, and I'm a professor at the Graduate Institute of International Studies, which is where the Center for Trade and Economic Integration is located. The center is the Graduate Institute's Center for Excellence on Research and Policy work with respect to trade. Just before I turn to the participants, the speakers, let me mention a few technical issues. The first one is that this event will be recorded and it will be available later on the CTEI website. Second, if you have questions to ask, and we will have about 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers, please submit them via the Q&A function. And lastly, at the end of the talk, there will be a satisfaction survey to be sent out. Please fill that in. Gives us valuable feedback in order to improve. So with that, the question really is, with this crisis going on, can the trade system do something to lessen the severity of the human suffering on the medical crisis and also the suffering created by the economic crisis? This is the first of a series of seminars where we'll look at the background facts, and we have four excellent speakers to introduce the various aspects of the problem. The first one is Suerie Moon, co-director of Global Health and a visiting lecturer in the Interdisciplinary programs at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. Suerie, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to wear the health hat, though I have to say that I'm not a medical doctor, and we always have to say this in global health. I thought I would start today with just a few facts and figures in terms of a number of the trade developments that have occurred in the context of the current pandemic that have been of concern, certainly to the health community. And what you see in front of you is data from the WTO, which is most likely an undercount because this relies on self-reporting by members. But it shows you that there have been 69 export restrictions put in place by 44 members, 69 easing of import restrictions put in place by 42 members, and a number of other restrictions put in place. And what's interesting to note is that this is the opposite of the kind of trade restriction that we usually see in outbreaks. Usually what we see is that countries actually limit, they block imports coming from countries that are directly affected by an epidemic. So for example, pork coming from Mexico during the 2009 H1N1 quote-unquote swine flu. If we look at what were the object of these trade restrictions, we can see unsurprisingly that the majority affected personal protective equipment such as masks. But there were also restrictions on, of course, many other products that are necessary for a country to get an outbreak under control: medical equipment, therapeutics, food, ventilators, diagnostics, etc. And this, of course, has created shortages in countries that are not self-sufficient in the production of these goods, which is most countries in the world. So I think the key question for consideration here, broadly by this webinar, is, are trade rules and institutions in fact sufficient for addressing these types of issues? Certainly they were not built for pandemics. And in my opinion, there's a key question as to whether reform can be done, and in fact, if it's feasible. And a number of the expert panels that have reviewed previous responses to pandemics or outbreaks of infectious disease actually have concluded no. That not that reform is impossible, but that trade rules actually are not going to be helpful for addressing these types of undesirable repercussions. And the reason is that the system tends to move quite slowly, whereas in the middle of an outbreak or an emergency, you have restrictions very quickly. And so the trade system is too slow, in fact, to help us address undesirable restrictions. One of the problems is that trade repercussions are actually a major disincentive for countries to share information early when an outbreak happens within their own territory. And we know this is a big problem, and this is an ongoing issue of vibrant debate, I would say, within the global health community. But this is an area where I think more attention is needed. Now, we've seen already what the repercussions of trade restrictions can be on PPE and diagnostics. What many of us fear is that up next will be export restrictions on drugs and vaccines. And I think that this is something that is likely to happen, not possible, but in fact probable. That said, there is a wide consensus that the development of safe, effective drugs and vaccines that are available and affordable worldwide must be achieved as soon as possible. And what we heard last week, for example, at the World Health Assembly, was this phrase global public goods being used over and over again, including from a wide range of high level political leaders, such as President Macron of France, Chancellor Merkel of Germany, President Xi Jinping of China. Many countries made the argument that these products have to be available to everybody as quickly as possible. So what needs to happen to actually make these products available as global public goods? First, it's important that they're manufactured across a number of different countries around the world. And in order to enable manufacturing to happen worldwide, we need open and rapid sharing of data technology and IP. And this is important not only for manufacturing, but also to accelerate the development of products. We heard recently that there are 225 vaccine candidates currently in development. Much of that R&D will be wasted, or it will move too slowly unless research teams are willing to share information quickly with each other. There are a number of initiatives that have been put in place to try to address these concerns, including the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, which includes 10 organizations, and perhaps Thomas Cueni will speak to this. Other initiatives such as the WHO technology pool seeking to bring together intellectual property and other data and technology. The UN Tech Access Partnership that's seeking to facilitate technology transfer. So it's encouraging to see these new initiatives, but I think it's also important to think about what is the likely outcome of all of these dynamics. And my own prediction, I'm taking a risk going on the record in a recorded webinar saying this, but I think what we'll see is that there will be a patchwork mix of a number of different initiatives. A mix of nationalist and internationalist approaches. We will see a number of countries blocking exports of these products for some time, as well as others who are much more willing to collaborate. Global, regional, and national initiatives. So when the global initiatives that I just mentioned aren't expected to deliver for certain countries, certainly they'll take measures into their own hands. What this implies is that there will also be most likely a mix of both voluntary and compulsory measures, including on the licensing of IP, data, and technology. And what we've seen up to this point is that despite a number of calls for there to be rapid sharing of data, and this has happened across a number of research teams, the main dynamic that we still observe today is competition between countries and between firms. This is the main behavior that I think we continue to see today. And a big question for me is whether or not we'll see more of the collaboration that was called for last week at the World Health Assembly. To wrap up, I just wanted to highlight that I think it's a very important moment to look and think beyond business and politics as usual and to take a step back. If we think about the economic cost of this pandemic, it's been very challenging to put numbers on this. One of the latest estimates I saw was 6 to 9 trillion. This is an estimate from the Asian Development Bank. An estimate to cost to develop and produce vaccines globally is about 8 billion, so about 1/1000th of the economic damage. We should also recall that the investments in R&D have been significantly de-risked. So we've seen at least $5 billion of public sector investment being committed for drug and vaccine research and development. And what is currently under discussion is the mobilization of further public funds to pay for manufacturing and or procurement on the other side. And so a lot of public money going in and a lot of risk being assumed by various governments around the world. I wanted to just conclude by saying that ensuring globally equitable access to drugs and vaccines is, of course, important for global public health, but it's also very important for the global economy that both really benefit from being able to put in place international arrangements for equitable, rapid access. So this is not only of concern to the health community, but this does raise two questions. One is, will investors and the few firms that are in a position to benefit, will they be willing to forego short-term monopolies and the profits that are linked to that in order to, in fact, provide benefits for the broader public good? And will enough producing countries also forego some of their short-term self-interest and serving only their own people first in order to enable this to happen? And I think certainly today this remains an open question. For those of you who are interested in the angle of investors, I just wanted to share with you an article in which we discuss this angle in a bit more depth that was published recently. Thanks very much. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Suerie. They're very informative. I'm sure you've sparked lots of questions. I can see already a few Q&A questions coming in. The next speaker is Thomas Cueni, who is Director General of the International Federation for Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. He is on the board of the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Association and is chair of business at OECD Health Committee. I'd also like to add that he's an alumni of the Graduate Institute, or at least took some training here. So please, Thomas, 7 minutes, if you will. Sure.
Thank you very much, Richard. Actually, it was in the time of Arthur Dunkel, which means quite some time ago, when I was at the Graduate Institute. In terms of where I come from, I don't have slides, but I want to share some reflections in terms of the COVID-19 public health crisis. I think it is unprecedented. I quite often say it's a combination of 1918 Spanish flu with 1929 depression when you look at the economic impact. What is interesting, and I was thinking about that looking at Surie's slide, when you look at how the pharmaceutical industry from the beginning, the innovative one, engaged, it was a plea and a call for open trade, open borders. And when we look at continuity of supply, namely so far in terms of access to therapeutics, and we have not many approved yet, it is quite amazing how the innovative industry has actually done reasonably well. We haven't seen scares about shortages. When you look at the export restrictions, which Suerie mentioned, it was primarily about masks and PPEs. There was mentioning of therapeutics too, but on the whole, and we had weekly exchanges with Mariangela Chimard and her team from WHO, truly concerned that the manufacturing impact of COVID-19 in China, for example, could have vast consequences around the world. I think there are two elements which helped us to so far handle this reasonably well. Notwithstanding the rhetoric about nationalism, most countries allowed borders and free flow of goods. One of the reasons is, and I give you one example, diagnostics testing was crucial at the beginning. The first company which had the test approved, the PCR test, was Roche. Their test had three components, one manufactured in the US, one in Germany, and the other one in Switzerland. And unless each of these three countries allowed the components to be traded freely, the test would not have worked. And we have seen the same on a number of elements. And we also were encouraged that G20, a little while later, WHO and WTO did call for, please do leave your borders open. One of the elements which certainly helped us, and I occasionally call it the Brexit, side effect, our industry was probably reasonably well prepared in terms of contingency plans, because we were a bit scared in Europe in particular what the impact of a hard Brexit could be. But therefore, in the innovative side, we haven't seen it. When we need international collaboration is, for example, on regulatory convergence. I recently had a discussion on the Vaccines Accelerator, which is one of these call to action collaborations on how can you do collaboration on end-to-end vaccine manufacturing. And we talked about the problems. In normal times, it takes up to 4 years to get a new formulation of an existing vaccines approved, regulatory approval across Africa. That is a big challenge. Again, having said that, notwithstanding the headlines on nationalism, I see extraordinary amount of collaboration between private companies and public sector and regulatory agencies. FDA is front and center, NIH is front and center, and they do talk daily with their colleagues at EMA in Europe, PMDA in Japan, and other parts of the world. Therefore, on the whole, I do believe that the system has been more resilient than we might have been afraid it would have been. Where I see, and I fully agree with Suerie, this is not business as usual. Therefore, our industry, which is based on fierce competition, fierce rivalry, strong IP, and everybody, accepting that sort of winner takes all, or the one who takes the big risks and succeeds and scores, he should get a higher reward. I think here we have seen outreach and collaboration between companies, big MNCs and other big MNCs, with academic institutions like the Oxford Jenner Institute, vaccine with AstraZeneca, a big pharma with biotech, and also big pharma actually reaching out and becoming part of this access accelerator. It's really, when I look at this Geneva collaboration, Geneva-based, because most of the institutions are in Geneva, you have three pillars. One is on vaccines, one is on therapeutics, and the other one is on diagnostics. The people who are in there, the institutions, they honestly acknowledge they need the private sector as a crucial partner, and they also acknowledge the private sector is relatively well equipped to fast response because of a flourishing innovation ecosystem. Where we need to be conscientious is we are concerned about equitable, affordable, and available. Now, the issue which Suerie alluded to in terms of the global public good, I hesitate to use that term because as an economist, it makes me nervous because depending on where you come from, you get from 10 people 10 different definitions of what's a global public good. Now, air is a global public good, something which is scarce and will be scarce for probably months and years to come. It's difficult to say it is a global public good because simply there are allocation challenges. One of the reasons why we joined the accelerators is we do believe that we from the innovative industry, we from the richer countries, we do have a responsibility to make best efforts to make sure that no one is left behind. And upfront, there will be parts of the scarce resources allocated for people in LMICs. For example, when you look at the vaccine, in particular, the healthcare workers should be among the first immunized. And we really need a global allocation mechanism and guidance where the countries from G20 putting up the money, they need to put aside at least part of the manufacturing capacity so that people there will not be left out. Just want to say one point because IP was mentioned here. I think IP has been an enabler in our fast response. When it comes to vaccines, patents are not really the main, IP issue. It is know-how, it is the knowledge of scaling up manufacturing, and not for nothing in the history, if I'm well informed, the history of, for example, IP, I'm not aware of a single compulsory licensing on a vaccine, because even if you would try, it wouldn't help you much, because you can't impose a CL on know-how. Either you have it or you don't. What you need is a willingness to collaborate. And I can tell you, I'm actually pretty proud how our industry, including on affordability and the understanding, this is not the time to make big bucks. This is the time to show responsibility and to work with others such as WHO, CEPI, Gavi, to work together. Look forward to the discussion.
Crosby, who is, yes. Our next speaker is Daniel Crosby, who is a partner of international trade practice at King & Spalding, a international trade lawyer of decades of experience and a very familiar face to us here in Geneva. And Daniel, there was already some talk about trade rules and IP, but let's have your 7 minutes and we can get into a discussion afterwards with the back and forth. So please, Daniel.
Great. Thanks, Richard and CTEI team for the invitation. So I'll jump right in on trade policy and law. So from my perspective, the COVID-19 crisis is different from all other financial and economic crises that the world has seen. I agree with Thomas's characterization of kind of putting together the last very, very difficult pandemic and financial and economic crisis that we had back in the 20s. So here, I think it's appropriate to talk through the key differences from, for example, 2008, 2009 financial crisis, and consider how those differences require different trade policy responses as compared to the prescriptions that have served us well in response to other crises. I will also go through in brief the recently released G20 ministers' statement on COVID-19, the public document that I think captures where G20 countries stand on their collective response to the pandemic. So first, Richard, I'd like to set the stage by acknowledging your recent contribution to the topic and a particular Vox piece that you did in April on the balance required for what you call, quote, creating wealth while protecting health. And one of your main points that I took away was that we shouldn't approach COVID-19 with the standard kind of economic cost-benefit analysis that weigh the value of human lives against economic losses. Rather, I think you suggest we need to find a way forward by balancing medical imperatives with citizens' ability to tolerate certain restrictions and on their lives and livelihoods. And suggest here that a kind of similar approach to balance is required in the trade policy context, that we need to balance well-intentioned restrictions in the form of trade policy rules with the perceived needs and real needs of countries and their citizens. So maybe the standard dose of trade policy response won't work to every aspect of this crisis. I'll park that for a second and come back while I turn now to a discussion of the key issues that trade policy responses to COVID-19 crisis have raised. So first, just a question: why is the crisis today different from other crises, including the 2008-2009 financial crisis? And three short reasons that I've come up with. First, it's a health crisis. It's not at its core caused by economics or finance. That's the trade and economic issue comes about from the health crisis. Also, it's a supply and demand crisis at the same time, and especially in this case for medical and pharmaceutical goods, whose production in a lot of these goods is highly concentrated and supply chain based. I think it was interesting what Thomas said about the lack of protectionism on a lot of this stuff, but I would observe that it's easier to avoid trade, especially export restrictions, when you're only exporting a component. It's only the country that produces the good in the end that we worry about. So many of the proposed solutions to the health crisis, is the third point, are difficult to reconcile with economic and trade policy if we think about the narrative of we need to bring manufacturing back home or nearer to home. So in addition to those differences, the international geopolitical context that we have to consider in the context of trade policy is very different from other crises for a couple of reasons. The first is this current context doesn't really call for economic efficiency. First of all, as Thomas said, it's time that we don't need to focus on profits, but really on other things. And to achieve the goals that Suerie mentioned, sometimes we need to put down these traditional approaches to trade and think about more how governments are cooperating and intervening. Also, this crisis has happened and exacerbated in an existing trade crisis context where there's a lack of trust. And finally, the crisis is unfolding in the context of weakened WTO guardrails, with the United States in the trade policy context really intentionally on the sidelines. So with those key issues in mind, we'll go through now the usual kind of trade policy responses, and just quickly on the import duty side, right? If you need more face masks, you would think that you would reduce the tariff on face masks. But if your goal, or if your politicians or public is saying, why don't we produce face masks here, then there's pressure to keep the tariff flexible, and the ability to have a higher tariff to do what you would think would be to encourage local manufacturing by maintaining a tariff, which is the usual trade policy instrument. Then you consider export restrictions, which were already mentioned, trade facilitation to make trade move faster, support for domestic production, international production through manufacturing and investment measures, IP, which was already mentioned, as well as standards and services trade. So all of these issues in this mix of usual trade policy instruments were discussed in the context of the G20, whose ministers met on May 14th and issued a statement, which is a combination of short and long-term collective actions, which is significant because they agreed to implement them together based on a set of rules and maybe an agenda for future attention and discussion in the long term. So on the list of short-term issues, and I'll pull this up on the screen so you can see some of the things that I have highlighted. Here we have the short-term collective actions. Really, the only interesting thing here under 1.1.1 is this restatement of the leaders target that these measures should be, shouldn't apply to everything, should be time limited, they should be targeted and make sure they go away when the need is done. This kind of similar approach, but less stringent on agricultural products, but everybody still sees the necessity there of making sure we don't restrict agricultural trade. On trade facilitation, interesting recognition of the importance of the existing trade facilitation agreement, a collective effort to accelerate the implementation of certain articles that help goods move across borders more quickly, and then a list of issues here, recognizing that ministers of economy and industry who handle investment, and you'll see a repeating theme throughout this thing, that expansion of production capacity is very important, not only for domestic production, as you would think in the protectionist way, but looking at how we reallocate production so it's not so concentrated to make supply chains more resilient and not just depending on businesses to do it in the cheapest place possible. An interesting cross-border travel for people as well. There's a discussion of medical professionals as well as business people. And I'll get right to the end here with the longer term, I'm sorry, just one reference to transparency, the existing rules that require notification of existing measures, but then also an additional commitment to share best practices. So that's a kind of short-term measure as well to make sure everyone knows what each other's doing. And then to wrap up on the longer term, to give confidence to the international business community, it looks like they're making a statement here to say, look, we didn't forget about the WTO. We're going to follow the rules when applying measures now, and in the longer term, we're going to reform the WTO to make it even stronger and more responsive to our needs. The last part here, in building resilience in global supply chains, Richard and everyone at the Graduate Institute know well. this is a recognition by the G20 that once again we need to focus on supply chains and also looking at where investment is needed, and again the reference to new capacity for producing medical supplies, so that the issue of access is not politically limited to just a few countries. And as you will all probably have seen in the literature recently, you know, everything from masks to ventilators to a lot of the PPE stuff is really focused in the kind of 60 to 80% range in just 3 or 4 countries in the world. I will end with a comment that those G20 collective actions have some meaningful commitments. There's no new or binding trade policy commitments there in the form of, for example, tariffs, because there seems to be an ongoing discussion and consideration of whether kind of reducing tariffs and binding them low would have an effect on where future production of these products is going to go, into which countries or combination of countries, and whether we should just continue to let the market to decide internationally where those products are made and traded, or whether the governments should reserve some ability to determine where and by whom those are made. And I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I just would like to abuse my privilege and just point out that if what had happened was happening on food, nobody would be surprised, because of course we always were aware that food is something essential and not everybody is self-sufficient and there's lots of problems with it. It's just that 3 million cases of a new disease that appear in 2 or 3 months has made us realize that there are other things that also you might have to worry about self-sufficiency. So in a way, there's nothing new or evil about medical reactions we're seeing, the push for self-sufficiency. It's exactly what we see in food. It's just now that we realize that we might also have to do that otherwise. So let me just remind the audience that you can send in questions. Please type them into the Q&A. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end, and I'll pick out a few questions, hopefully groups of questions, to answer. Then I'll turn the floor straight over to Vyara Filipova, who is a technical attaché from the World Customs Organization and was head of international projects and management and multilateral cooperation at the Department of National Customs Agency in Romania before. Vyara, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I would like to share a few slides with you. So what I'm going to speak today is on the role of customs in disaster relief. Customs procedures and practices are an integral part of international trade. And by way of introduction, I would like to show the evolution of customs functions over time, starting with the very traditional function of revenue collection of import taxes, going through the protection of economic interests, something that was already touched upon, protection of society in terms of intercepting IPR crime, drug trafficking, firearms, environmental crime, etc., economic development, through to the overall security of the entire supply chain, through partnership with business by means of the WTO authorized economic operator program. And all these functions of customs are relevant to our topic today. The World Customs Organization, which I'm representing today, is the voice of the international voice of the customs community, or the global center of customs expertise. As you can see from the mission of the WTO, we have three main functions. The first one is to develop the international standards in the customs domain. The second is to provide the capacity building support to our members. And the third one is to foster cooperation with our partners at the international level, the private sector, and the academia. In terms of international standards, I would like to mention two of our flagship conventions. The first one is the International Convention on the Harmonized Commodity Description and Coding System, known as the Harmonized System Convention. This is the universal language for describing goods. The second one is the International Convention on the Harmonization and Simplification of Customs Procedures as amended, known widely as the revised Kyoto Convention. What customs can do to mitigate the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic? When the COVID-19 outbreak was declared by the World Health Organization as a pandemic, we invited our members to share their practices in mitigating the effects of this crisis. Because, as it was already said, there was a patchwork of national measures driven mainly by sanitary concerns. As of today, we have submissions from 112 WTO members. These are the customs administrations of our members. And analyzing them, we have highlighted 27 measures of what customs can do to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. These 27 measures are grouped in 4 categories, which are to a great extent interlinked. The first category is to facilitate the cross-border movement of relief and essential supplies. And in each of the 4 categories, I have selected up to 3 measures to illustrate the content. So customs are invited to coordinate and cooperate with other government agencies with the objective of speeding up the clearance of relief goods. This is because customs are very often enforcing legislation and measures on behalf of other government agencies. They are checking licenses, authorizations. That's why the coordinated border management is of paramount importance. The second one here is to prioritize the clearance of relief consignments on the basis of a list of essential items, and to provide for various trade facilitation measures, for example, pre-arrival processing of the goods declaration and release of the goods upon arrival. The second category is supporting the economy and sustaining supply chain continuity. And this is the category with the greatest number of measures that we have highlighted. The first one here is to ensure the business continuity, to set up crisis teams and to take measures to have personnel availability in the long term in such a health crisis. What is also recommended based on best practices from members is to operate a 24/7 customs clearance system. Another measure here is to apply risk management to keep physical inspections to the necessary minimum and thus speed up customs clearance. And what is recommended here is the optimum use of non-intrusive inspection or X-ray equipment. Customs are invited to introduce facilitative measures with regard to the requirements to submit original documents or to stamp certain documents. And this is particularly relevant in the conditions of lockdown and lack of flights, etc., etc. The third category is the category of protecting staff. And in addition to measures such as supplying personal protective equipment to staff, social distancing, etc., etc. What I want to highlight here is encouraging the use of electronic services in conducting business with customs. This is part of the social distances, but this is also a major trade facilitation measure. And the last category is protecting the society. What customs does in this category is intercepting the trafficking of counterfeited medical supplies, or expanding the tax-free use of undenaturated alcohol for the purposes of disinfectant production. And there were a number of customs administrations that donated this alcohol for the production of disinfectant, as well as apply, measure certain indicators and provide statistical data to the government to inform decisions in the response to the disaster. So these are highlights of measures already implemented by our member customs administration. What does the WTO do to support the members and stakeholders? We have a repository of existing as well as new instrument tools and guidance and databases. The existing ones are the revised Kyoto Convention, which has a specific chapter in specific Annex J on relief consignment, the Convention on Temporary Admission, which has an annex on the temporary admission of goods imported for humanitarian purposes, the guidance to this convention, a 2011 resolution of the Council on the role of customs in natural disaster relief, and the newly developed guidance, HS classification reference for medical supplies, a list of essential medicines with their HS code, the 6-digit code, guidance on how to establish and utilize essential goods list, and databases of export restrictions and import support measures. We also leverage on our partnerships with partner international organizations such as the International Maritime Organization, the Universal Postal Union, the World Trade Organization, organizations in the railway sector, as well as the private sector, the ICC, the International Road Transport Union, and the WTO has a private sector consultative group, which since the beginning of the pandemic is meeting weekly with the Secretary General and the Chair of the Council in attendance. And they also came up with a paper of the ideas and recommendations of the private sector on what customs can do to mitigate the effects of this pandemic. With this, I would wrap up my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. We had sort of planned to go around again among the panelists, but there was so much interesting stuff to be said. There's only really 10 minutes left for Q&A, so I think I will, maybe I'll ask if one of the panelists or two of the panelists have something pressing to say which wasn't mentioned as part of the background. Otherwise, I'll just go straight to Q&A. Daniel, please, go ahead.
Yeah, just really quickly, I wanted to pick up on a question or observation that Suerie had, and that is, will individual countries and governments forego serving their own citizens first and have more of a kind of international solidarity approach to things? And I would say that as far as we've seen so far, that we can't expect that, and we have to construct an international kind of supranational structure to address the interests of the countries who don't produce, who need to have an access to the things which other countries will limit trade in. If they produce it, they're going to give it to their own citizens first. And I think we have to find, I think we can expect that, and that's a natural political reaction, but we need to work hard to create a system to go around that. And I don't think anybody has a solution yet, but there's some good things going on at the WHO that we should pay attention to.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So what I'm going to do now is just pick out a couple of questions which are grouped, come up in a number of settings. So the first one has to do with global value chains. And by the way, could all the panelists unmute themselves now? So because we're going to have a kind of roundtable discussion. So a number of the questions were about global value chains and their very important role in medicines and protective equipment. And one of the questions more or less said, does it look like the policymakers have sort of forgotten about how these things, or not known how these things are actually made this time? We had the example of the diagnostic that was actually made in 3 countries, and we've had many examples where the precursors are made one place. So who would like to take that one first? If all the panelists would unmute themselves, that would be great. Who wants to take the
I can take a stab at that first, Richard, on the supply chain thing. So I think that it's not that the politicians have forgotten about it, it's that the politicians who were elected and who are the loudest about this have no idea how these things are, and their initial reaction is just to say, do it at home, we can't trust foreigners. And they really think that it's best to just reshore everything and make it at home and put their own people to work. And that misperception has just got to be dispelled as part of the kind of process of working this stuff through. And I think there is a reaction, even the EU and others who talk about supply chain resilience, and even though they say, well, it doesn't mean, don't take that in a protectionist way, but still, we need to make sure that we have access to this stuff that we need. So there's a balance that's going to be found there, but it's certainly not in bringing it all back home. Right.
I couldn't agree more. So, Suerie, and in particular, there's a question about how the WTO and WHO find themselves in a crisis right now, to a large extent due to the pressure that was put on by the US, by the Trump administration very, very recently. So how could we resolve this, or how is there a way to move forward in this, in the timeline of COVID? And one part at the end is, would a coalition of the willing be some sort of solution in this? Sir, if you could unmute yourself.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and we do unfortunately see that these kind of core institutions of multilateralism have been weakened or under attack directly by the Trump administration. What's striking to me is that at the World Health Assembly last week, that position was a relatively isolated position, by which I mean there was statement after statement of strong political support for the WHO. I'm certainly much less familiar with the WTO and what have been the developments there, but at the WHO, I think many countries have rallied around the organization in some ways as a direct result of some of the attacks coming from the U.S. government. Now, this is not necessarily in the best interest of the U.S. government because, of course, there are certain objectives that it wants to achieve working through the WHO, and we saw that in some of the negotiations over the resolution, for example, asking for a review of WHO's performance, an investigation into the origins of the virus, et cetera. So, it remains to be seen whether the administration will temper or change its strategy. It seems to be doubling down on, trying to build its own alternate organization. I mean, this is the news coming out of Washington this morning. It remains to be seen whether there will be much international support for that. You can't build a global outbreak preparedness and response organization alone as a single country. But for the moment, the trend seems to continue. If I could just piggyback on one thing that Daniel said, I think you rightly highlighted that countries are very interdependent when it comes to supply chains, and we've seen the results of that. I think countries are also quite interdependent, certainly at this moment, regarding the development of a vaccine, for example. There's no single country that is guaranteed to be the winner of the race. And out of the 10 candidates that are now in human trials and clinical trials, 6 of those are actually being developed in China or by Chinese firms. And so I think countries, the time to put in place binding international commitments is actually now, when countries don't know, will I be the one that happens to have the manufacturing or the rights to manufacture a product in my territory? And so if you think about the notion of negotiating a just arrangement behind the veil of ignorance, I think that's the moment that we're in now. And so we have to move very, very quickly to put in place strong commitments to share technology, to ramp up production, because the interdependent moment in terms of the knowledge is really now.
Thank you very much, Suerie. Thomas, if I could take you a segue through that question. A couple of the Q&As picked up your assertion that in some sense it's not really the IPA when it comes to vaccination, it's production capacity. So one question is that really impossible for countries to set up themselves? That's the first bit. And then I'd like you to segue a little bit into this Surie's question of the allocation. So can you tell us how sort of allocations of vaccines were done in the past, or discussion now in the pharmaceutical industry of how some sort of international allocation might be decided? Very open question, but I'm being quite leading. Thomas, please.
And there are two elements, Richard. One is about the capacity and the time it needs. The other one is about the allocation mechanism. In terms of the capacity, just to give you a little bit of gist, I haven't seen any good epidemiological analysis yet, but if you do a purely population-based analysis and you're looking at 80% of the world's population needs to be immunized against COVID-19, and on average, you may need 2 dosages to reach that impact. You would need about 12 billion doses. Right now, annual capacity, global manufacturing is about 5 billion. And that is for polio, seasonal flu, and you name it. And therefore, that is challenging. And if you tried to get that from scratch, 5 to 10 years would be a good estimate. Therefore, good luck. I think what many of us are hoping is something which is new, the messenger RNA kind of vaccines. The talk is might be much more agile, flexible, fast in terms of scaling up capacity, but the issue is there hasn't been a single one approved or tested yet. Therefore, that's a completely new technology. And Katie O'Brien from WHO, who is their vaccines czar, she said last week on CNN, if all goes well, we might have something in about 15 to 18 months, but I've never come across everything going smooth in vaccination. And one of the tiny little issues is, for example, with messenger RNA, if I'm well informed, you need to store them and transport them at -70 degrees, which provides another challenge, even in our parts of the world. Therefore, the allocation issue is a big one. There, I'm somewhat more optimistic than what you read in the media. The whole purpose of the May 4th pledge, which Ursula von der Leyen and Macron, Merkel and others led, is about creating, at least for some parts, a global allocation mechanism. And among the partners in the Vaccines Accelerator, which is co-led by CEPI and by Gavi, there's a consensus that WHO should really drive the guidance on allocation policy. Common sense is you want to give it to healthcare workers first, and then you probably would look at the vulnerable, which means people with comorbidities or the elderly, really vulnerable, and at least parts of the vaccines available should go into this kind of global allocation mechanism. Common sense, of course, is Donald Trump is not the only one who thinks that I want to make sure that my citizens get what they need. I would expect you will see other countries. My hope is that we will see a combination of, allocation on a global level, because H1N1 in 2009, where the rich countries bought up all the antivirals and vaccines until they realized that H1N1 wasn't as deadly as everybody feared, is not a good example, and I think we learned from that. Certainly we from the industry are a partner of the Vaccines Accelerator because we do want to have equitable, affordable, and available as an important vision.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We are almost out of time. I want to ask one more issue, which is, do we think that the idea, I'm going to just come back to this idea of a coalition of a willing, which sort of seemed to be forming with Macron, is that a way of sort of moving forward on this capacity, the medical things? But actually, Thomas, let me just ask you one very specific question. Which countries have this vaccine capacity that you were talking about, the 5 billion? Is Germany and Sweden?
There isn't that much in Germany yet. Actually, when you look at, it's not just the US. I would say the US is probably the only country where you could undertake a safe bet that one of the many candidates will come out of the US. And with BARDA, of course, they're much better prepared than all the other countries are. The US does have BARDA, which no other country have. In terms of vaccine capacity, you have huge facilities in Belgium. J&J as well as GSK, their vaccine capacity in Belgium is really big. Close to, since we are in Geneva, one of the oldest and biggest vaccine manufacturing plants in the world is in Marcy, just on the outskirts of Lyon. That's Sanofi Pasteur, founded in 1918 by Monsieur Mérieux.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we have come to the end of this, and we kind of have a tradition of starting and ending on time, so I am going to end it on time. Sorry, I didn't have a question for you, Vyara. I do want to remind you that there will be a questionnaire survey, of whether you liked it and what we could do better, that will be sent to all the participants. Please do take the time to fill that out, because we know that we're not perfect, but we want to get more perfect every time. And then I will just remind you that this recording will be posted on our website. It'll take a couple of days to process that, but it will be there. And I want to thank all the panelists for sharing your wisdom and your time with us. I think it was very stimulating. I personally would have had another hour's worth of questions to go through. I also want to thank the people at Center for Trade and Economic Integration, in particular Tamara and Angelica, who work so hard to make this thing. And with that, I will close the session, and thank you all very much. Just to remind you, next Wednesday, same time, same place, we're going to have a discussion of the policies about trade and health that have come up. So please join us next Wednesday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.